I think especially in light of the advent of Antifa, if you look at what's going on there, you have some pretty bad dudes on the other side also, and essentially that's what I said. Now, because of what's happened since then with Antifa, you look at, really what's happened since Charlottesville. A lot of people are saying, in fact, a lot of people have actually written, gee, Trump might have a point. I said you got some very bad people on the other side also, which is true.
Welcome back to the 11th hour. There it was today on Air Force One. Mark Landler of the New York Times writes it this way, quote, President Trump thrust himself back into the racial storms of Charlottesville on Thursday, repeating his charge that those resisting the neo-Nazis and white supremacists were as much to blame as the alt-right crowds who marched on the Virginia college town last month. The president made those comments while describing a conversation with South Carolina Republican Tim Scott, the only black Republican in the U.S. Senate. Now, tonight, the White House has announced that President Trump has signed the joint resolution from Congress that urged the president to speak out against hate groups that espouse racism, extremism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and white supremacy. A lot to talk about. With us tonight, Gillian Tett, U.S. managing editor at the Financial Times. Author and presidential historian Michael Beschloss is back with us, as is Chicago Tribune columnist Clarence Page. Clarence, what was your gut reaction when you heard the verbiage, when you heard he was going there again?
Well, I had an image in my head of President Trump trying to dance through nuance with two left feet. He's a man who, as we know, he talks in one-syllable words, and he talks in terms of black and white as if he's colorblind to gray. And as a result, he cannot say that there were some people who misbehaved on the side of the Antifa folks, but most of the misbehavior came from the neo-Nazis and the Klansmen. Instead, he spoke in a way that seemed to equalize the two, and he can't get past that. That's why he could very comfortably sign this bill that condemns the racists, the Ku Klux Klan, the neo-Nazis, etc., but has a hard time saying it. He just is able to do it on paper. So I think this is something we're going to have to live with, because President Trump is the kind of guy who could never admit that he makes a mistake or that he can't articulate something. So he just keeps making the same mistake over and over again.
Michael, can you remember another time when a president has been, in effect, corrected by a joint resolution, or a joint resolution was used as a tool of Congress to reset something internal to the president?
No. I mean, in modern times, who could have imagined that we'd be in a situation that the House and Senate feel compelled to send the president this resolution demanding that he denounce white supremacists, and then at the same time he gives this statement that we've been talking about on that plane. I think I have a slightly darker view of this than Clarence does, a slightly more acerbic view, which is that I think Donald Trump today was getting his head handed to him by conservative commentators who were angry at what he seems to be doing about DACA and about the wall. And he sort of cynically thinks that by sort of, having a replay of these awful comments, equating the people who were neo-Nazis in Charlottesville with those who were trying to protect the citizens of Charlottesville against them, that somehow he's going to sort of blunt the anger of the conservatives. Not going to work.
Gillian, none of our news, of course, stays here in this globe the way electronics are. How did the president's remarks on this subject specifically, this both sides business, how has this played around the globe?
Well, people are just completely astonished that people are still talking about this, and even more astonished that the president keeps stirring up this hornet's nest quite needlessly. And I spent a lot of time recently in the White House talking to people about what's been going on, and essentially the issue is that people around him recognize they're frustrated that it doesn't actually bring about very much good doing this. And yet President Trump is somebody who simply cannot stand to be attacked. He has to prove that he's right. And for better or worse, he does feel that there needs to be more of a spotlight on Antifa and what they did. And so he keeps coming back to this point over and over again. but it's incredibly self-destructive in many ways in terms of trying to keep the White House on track with any kind of message or action.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.